Good evening, everyone. This evening's satsang is from chapter 3 of the book Sadhu Beware, which I encourage everyone to read either before or after these satsangs on a weekly basis, or you could just sit down and read the whole thing at once. And last week I was supposed to give a technique or a tip for being a brahmachari, which really means just a tip for staying on the spiritual path, for staying spiritually strong, and I forgot to do so. So I want to start by giving last week's tip. Last week was, we were discussing chapter 2 in the book Sadhu Beware, and that chapter was on humility, and I thought a wonderful tip is this, that every day, most of us, we look in the mirror, either when we're brushing our teeth or fixing our hair or whatever it is. And I know this technique came to me through Swami Kriyananda. I'm not exactly sure how, but I know that it did. But anyway, the technique is this, that when you look in the mirror, simply pay attention to your thoughts. You'll find it a remarkable practice of what's going on within you, what's going on with your ego, how magnetism works. So it's a very simple technique. Simply just pay attention to your thoughts every day when you look into the mirror. So that was last week's technique, and so that I don't forget again, I'll give this week's technique right now. And this week's chapter, this chapter 3, is called Developing Humility. And so I'll start with a little story. There was a time when I was asking Swami Kriyananda about a technique that we have called Navi Kriya. And without going into the technique, in that technique you keep your head down and then you put your head up. And I asked Swamiji, why do we keep our head down in Navi Kriya and then why do we put it up? And he said, oh, I don't know. But maybe, and he would often do that actually. You would ask him a question and he would say, I don't know. And it was his way, as if he had any little trace of ego lingering, he would just push that little ego to the side by just saying, I don't know. And then you say, but maybe. And then the answer would come to him, and that's not the technique. But anyway, so he said, I don't know, and then he said, oh, maybe you keep your head down in order to concentrate your energy down in the third chakra, as is done in that technique. And then he said, and maybe then you lift your head up in order to take that awakened energy and bring it up into the higher chakras, up to the spiritual eye. And then he turned the tables on me and he asked me a question. And I froze in fear. I thought, this isn't fair. You know, there was a lot of people around and I thought, you're the teacher, I'm the student here. What business do you have asking me questions? And anyway, the question he asked me was, where do you think the average person's consciousness is? Where is it centered in their own body? And I thought, well, perhaps it's here at the medulla, that most people are centered in their ego, and we knew that that's where the ego lives, and he said yes. And then he said, where do you think a master's consciousness is centered? And I hazarded a guess that here at the spiritual eye, and he said, yes, that's right. And it sounds so simple, but it was in that way of teaching and asking me the question that really I realized, oh, I must strive to keep my attention here at the spiritual eye at all times. If that's where a master keeps their attention, well then I want to become a master in this lifetime, so I too should keep my attention at the spiritual eye at all times. And so that is the technique. It's a very simple technique, and yet it takes us many, many incarnations to learn how to perfect that technique. And yet it's so simple that really we're just trying to take our awareness, which is normally here, and move it here. And we do that in meditation. And as we become deep meditators, we'll learn how to feel that our energy is certainly centered here, and a wonderful sensation will begin to develop here. But then the trick is we have to learn how to bring that meditation into daily life. And when we're eating our breakfast, we still want to keep our attention here. And when we're talking to people and answering mundane questions, we still want to keep our attention here and realize that it's God through us who's processing questions, who's answering questions, who's asking questions, all of these different things. And if we can do that with our attention here, we'll realize that God is within us doing all these things. Anyway, so getting into this chapter of developing humility, the first thing that Swamiji writes in this chapter is, when one of his brothers was a child, I think 2 or 3 years old, I don't remember exactly. His mother was talking to all of them, and his mother started a sentence with simply the word my this or that or whatever. And that small child, his name was Robert, he said, "No, not my's me, Wobbert." He couldn't even say his own name, Robert, at that time. "My's me, Wobbert." And so as that small child, he had not come to understand that each one of us lives in ego, and that there's many different egos. So if I say my truck or my whatever, it's referring to this sense of ego, but he only could understand his sense of ego. So he said, not mine's me. And it's a wonderful thing, actually, because you'll notice that people with a strong sense of ego, they're always referring everything back to themselves. That you say a story and they'll try to top it and say, no, you should have seen when that happened to me. I did this, and wasn't that so smart? And then people that have a very less sense of ego, that a story might be told, and they'll still keep conversation going, but they're not necessarily going to relate the story or the conversation back to themselves. And so and the next chapter is learning how to become an ego detective, I think, or tips for ego transcendence. And so we want to learn to start to pay attention with how are we behaving, how are we acting in this world? Are we coming from that sense of ego, relating everything back to ourselves? Or are we coming from this higher center, relating everything back to God? And in the beginning on the spiritual path, it's very difficult to know what is God? Who is God? What is all of this God business? But we at least can begin to realize, are we trying to bring everything to ourselves, or are we trying to be a person who's sharing, who's kind, who's thinking of other people? That kindness too is God, that love is God, and that even in a simple act of kindness, that we are releasing the grip that ego has on us, and that we are starting to begin this long process of merging back in God. Now, back to that story, "My me, Wobbert," that Master used to say that God is center everywhere, circumference nowhere. Now, just from our own center, our own ego, that means that we have the ability to expand our consciousness out to infinity. That from this one little point of awareness within ourselves, that as we grow spiritually, that Master knew everything that was going on in the ashram. He knew all of his disciples' thoughts, which is just absolutely fascinating, that even in a huge crowd of maybe 100 people, Swamiji said that Master would be giving some deep philosophical point, and Swami, he would deeply get it in his mind, and Master would look at him and smile, and just say, that's right, that you got it. And Swamiji said that goes way beyond ordinary telepathy of just being able to maybe communicate or transfer a few thoughts between your friend every once in a while here and there. That Master was within all people, and that he knew all of their thoughts at all times. And so that's the ability that we get to have, is the ability to expand our consciousness out to infinity. And now the fascinating part of this is that God also is in an infinity of centers. It's not just from our own center, yes, we'll radiate out, but as we expand and gain that God consciousness, then we get to be in all centers, and each center has the potential to radiate out to infinity and to become conscious of infinity. And speaking so much of consciousness now, there was a philosopher named Descartes, and he had a philosophy. It was, I think, therefore I am. And so we're trying to think, now how do we get our consciousness out into infinity? How could we know the thoughts of all mankind? Or in Master's poem Samadhi, he even says, every blade of grass, that he was conscious of being in every blade of grass. You just start thinking, how many blades of grass are there on the planet? That even if I dedicated my entire life to trying to answer that question and started counting blades of grass and make up mathematical formulas of how many patches of grass there are on the planet, that, somebody would develop one and the whole theory would already go off track. But Master didn't get there intellectually. He didn't get there with the intellect. I think, therefore I am, is wrong. That it's I am, therefore I think. That first comes consciousness. What this means is, in meditation, if we can still our thoughts, there's still awareness. And actually, the way to have deep awareness is to still our thoughts. So this I think, therefore I am is completely flip-flopped, completely not right. I am, therefore I think. And so we want to strive to get back to that state of pure awareness. I remember I was in Chennai with Swamiji, and he was giving a satsang, having just an informal tea. And he just posed a very simple question. He said, "Where do thoughts come from?" I really started scratching my head, and I was in a dilemma already because I wanted to be listening to him and not pondering these deep questions and thinking, but I couldn't help it. I really had to think about that. It was such a wonderful question. Where do thoughts come from? And in Autobiography of a Yogi, Master tells us that thoughts are universally and not individually rooted. That all thoughts are out there, always vibrating, that they're eternally there. And that so it's our job to decide what thoughts do we want to be channels for. And that as yogis we want to learn to perfect ourselves so that we don't let the bad thoughts in, so that we're not constantly thinking these wrong thoughts all the time. And it's unfortunate, but we have to take responsibility for ourselves on such an even high level of thought, of begin to take responsibility of our own thoughts. And which ones are we going to let in? Which ones aren't we going to let in? If there's some hoodlum out there outside of this mandir, dressed in black with knives and guns, we'd quickly shut the door and lock it and think, we're not going to let that guy in. And yet some crazy thought comes in and we go, oh yeah, come in, I'll let this one spin around for a while. But it's not right when we can see it physically, and that's why we're in this physical world, to learn these lessons that sometimes are higher lessons. Anyway, we can learn all of these lessons, and we will learn to take responsibility for ourselves on every level of our being, for what we do in this physical world, for our emotions, and for our thoughts. But we must remember at the end of the day, they're not ours. So that if a bad thought comes in, it doesn't mean we are a bad person. Ultimately, we are infinite consciousness, that we can't be a bad person. We've just been a channel for that, for the amount of time that we want to let that thought roll around within us. But at the end of the day, we have to give it all back. And one way to give it all back is to offer everything right here, that we can raise our level of consciousness by keeping our mind right here. And when we raise our level of consciousness, then the bad thoughts don't come in. I had an interesting experience this morning. I simply took the iPod and just listened to one. It's not even really a song of Swamiji. It's called Metaphysical Meditations. And Swamiji's just simply reading. It's like a poem of Masters. And that one thing just changed my consciousness so much. Suddenly from the course of the day, I'd kind of plotted out that I would just take a lazy day and just do nothing. And I thought, I at least can start off with a high consciousness and listen to this one song, this one poem. And suddenly, after that, I could do this, and I can do this, and I may as well do that. And everything simply changed. It was by changing the level of consciousness, which, as we grow on the spiritual path, the Masters will give us so many different ways to change our level of consciousness. Here's another thing, speaking of consciousness, that Swamiji used to talk about a lot. He would say that each one of us is unique. That this thing of ego, and it's a fascinating thing to contemplate and to think about, that each one of us is unique. It means that each one of us will take our own individual way back to God. That on some level there are certain mileposts, we would say in America, along the road that are going to be the same for everyone, that we start to become more kind, more tolerant, more peaceful. Yes. But how we get to those different mileposts is up to each one of us, and how we learn our own lessons is up to each one of us. And Swamiji would often say, 2 eyes, 2 ears, a nose, and a mouth. And yet they reflect so much difference in each person. And when I first came on the spiritual path, I just thought, No, they don't. We're all pretty much human beings, and yeah, we have a nose and a mouth. Yeah. What are you trying to say here? But as I became more refined, and I probably still have a long ways to go, but as I became more refined spiritually, I started to look into people's eyes. I started to notice subtle details in their face that would show that soul has been going on and on and on, perhaps for millions of incarnations, and developing different tendencies, maybe a snarl or maybe a kind smile that you just trust when you meet that person. And that each one of us has been developing these different tendencies, these different understandings of life as we go. Another thought I was pondering the other day, that we think that everything that we do, that, we have to do this, and the organization needs me for this and that. On one level, no. God doesn't need you, and everything that you're good at, that you've made yourself good at over many incarnations, it's just so you can learn your lessons on how to get back to God. But on one level, God doesn't need you, that you're just here to learn all of your lessons. And we can't learn them all at once. We might know that we need to drink 15 or 20 gallons of water in a month, but we can't just say, we're going to drink all that water today and just get it over with. Life just doesn't work like that. We have to slowly learn our lessons one by one, day after day. And then we develop even our facial features, begin to reflect that uniquely we are finding God in our own special way. And in the end, I see that as so beautiful, really. It's so precious that God has cast himself out into the many, and that he's coming back, bringing himself back through each one of us, and that he will get back, and that he will find himself in himself. There's a chant that Master has, I will drown myself in myself. And that's the first stage of of Sabikalpa Samadhi, that we offer that ego here. And it's like we're going to kill ourselves, that we're dying. The Master said, I killed Yogananda long ago. No one dwells in this temple now but God. I was just thrilled when I first heard those words. And it doesn't mean that we're committing suicide or killing this physical body. No. It means that we're killing this sense of ego, that we no longer dwell in the thought of I am so important. And then the other part of that chant, I will find myself in myself. And that's when we go into Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and when the game's completely over and we realize that it's always just been God. Another thing I've been reflecting on lately, Swamiji said that he had reason to believe that he achieved Sabikalpa Samadhi in a past life. He said, but that was thousands of years ago. And he said, then that becomes the ultimate test. That within that ego, you get the ability to merge yourself back into God, and you still think, now I have all of the powers of all of the universe. And whenever I want, I can merge myself back into God, but it's still ego, and it's the final test. And what a test that must be. I really don't know anything about it, but it's kind of scared me a little bit to think that thousands of years, that he achieved that thousands of years ago, and then now he's still coping with that final test. But it's all right, that even that, eventually we will pass all of the tests, and that we have to do it with courage, we have to do it with conviction, not with a sense of meek and mildness and, I don't know when I get there and I hope I'll get there. That we have to know that God will do it through us, and when we do it with God, that we will get there. So the final point that I want to make this evening is, Swamiji so far has stressed this in every chapter, but he ended this chapter with this, that it has to be pointed out that the first, the last, the only really thing to do on the spiritual path is to transcend our ego, is for us to really move our consciousness, our awareness from here to there, for us to really say, God, I give absolutely everything that I've ever done in the past, that I am doing right now, that I will ever do in the future, to you, because it's been you that's been doing it anyways. And it's just this little ego that we trick ourselves with, that we think that we're the doer. And it's such a simple, formula, such a simple thing to understand, but difficult to accomplish. But the point is that it's the only thing that we have to accomplish. So whatever we get wrapped up with in the world, that we think we have to do that, we have to accomplish this, if we have to do this, it's right that we do these goals, because we end up in the end gaining confidence in God, that God can do this thing to us and do this thing. And ultimately we gain the confidence that God can, through us, cast this ego back into that infinite sea of awareness. And that as we do this, it's not like climbing Mount Everest, where it's just, as it gets higher and higher, there's less and less oxygen, and that it just gets harder and harder, that it becomes easier and easier. Master's words were, when all efforts end in ease.